All right, we're up to the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Esther, one of two books in the Old Testament recounting the story of two great women. Ruth, of course, is one we talked about a few weeks ago. Her story, although it didn't take a lot of chapters, I believe just 4 chapters there, but as I think we talked about at that point, a great love story that ultimately points to the redemption we have in Christ. Looking ahead a lot of centuries yet, but Ruth's story is an amazing one. And Esther, of course, is the same way. A little bit longer book, I think 10 chapters, but no less important. I guess we could say it's a love story as well, not in the same vein as Ruth, but we see God's love for his people in this book, and especially for a courageous young woman in a foreign land. Amazing story. So we'll talk about the highlights of that as we move forward. As we always do, this is another anonymous book. We don't know exactly who the author is. Study I did this week shows there's several guesses at that. And I guess that comes with the territory. If you don't know for sure, you're going to have people arguing over who it ought to be. I don't know that we have to spend a lot of time there because these books were accepted as inspired by the people who lived at the time and who followed on. So a lot of attestation there, but some suggest that Mordecai was the author. Mordecai plays a role. It was Esther's relative. I think maybe some versions call him uncle. Sometimes the Hebrew word is broader than the way it's interpreted, but either way, a close relative, someone who's concerned for Esther. And by the way, the setting again is in the exile. The last few studies we've been looking at, we've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and now Esther are all in that period after the Jewish people were taken into Babylonian captivity and before they were released to go back to rebuild Jerusalem, the temple and the walls. That was Nehemiah. So Esther fits kind of right in the middle of that. It was after the Persian King Cyrus started letting the people go back, and I think last week we talked about there were at least 3 particular waves or groups of people that made that trek, led by different men. So Esther was after that, but yet before a lot of the rebuilding began. Again, there's a mention as far as the author goes in chapter 9, verse 20. It says that Mordecai recorded these events as he was preparing to send letters to the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. So that's one thing scholars grab onto. Well, that sounds like Esther or Mordecai. Some believe Esther recorded. She was obviously the main character of all of this. So you can pick whoever you like, I guess, on that, or go on the internet and find more than you care to read about the discussion. We're just going to approach it from as a God-inspired writing. The interesting thing about the book of Esther, though, is there's no mention of God by name in the book, which is odd, right? Most of the rest of the Old and New Testament books, God's name comes up over and over again. This is one that it doesn't, but don't let that lead us to believe that God isn't at work here. He certainly is. And when we talk about the theme in just a moment, just because God's name isn't on it doesn't mean that his fingerprints aren't all over the story, because I believe that they are. Esther, of course, was one of the exiles taken back. The Persians now, of course, they were the ones who conquered the Babylonians. And it was King Cyrus of Persia that had started to allow, at God's leading, the people to go back to Jerusalem. But those Babylonian captives that were under Nebuchadnezzar now become under the auspices of the Persian Empire. And Esther is living in those situations. She rises to a great position. She eventually becomes queen. You know, this Jewish girl that was in exile rises to a great position of leadership, and it is an amazing study. The date For the events recorded in the book took place from about 483 BC to 472 BC. About a 10 or 11 year window right in there somewhere. So obviously the writing of the book had to come after that, looking back on these events. We won't spend time here, but I ran across, this is one of those books that there's a lot of external historical dates tied to the Persian Empire that you can kind of tie some specific times to a lot of these events, and that's why the time frame is a little more clear than some of the others. All right, a quick outline of the book of Esther. Again, 10 chapters, but quite a story. I've divided it up, or I'm using the outline given by Norman Geisler. He has a book on a popular survey of the Old Testament that I like pretty well. One of the books I had to buy in preacher's school. But he does a good job. He's a well-known scholar. Here's how he divides it up, and I couldn't improve upon it, so we'll use his. Chapters 1 through 4, the beginning of the book, he titles The Grave Danger to the Jews. And this is just setting the groundwork for the hero that Esther would become. You know, just because the Persians kicked out the Babylonians didn't mean that they were necessarily, the cream of the crop as far as godly people. The kings of Persia had their problems. We are introduced to a man named Ahasuerus in chapter 1. He's the current king at the beginning of the story, and he's throwing a party and wants to, this is just a quick run through the history. He wants to parade his wife before, a kind of a drunken party, and she doesn't want any part of that anyway. So the king's advisors say, well, you can't have, this go on. Everybody's going to start revolting. So a search is put into place to find a new queen. And lo and behold, guess who is going to be part of that? It's Esther. All the eligible, if you will, young women in the kingdom are brought and groomed to take part in this, I guess for lack of a better term, beauty contest. And Esther ends up being chosen, which again, the sense you get from the story is that, it isn't revealed later till of her national heritage, but anyway, she rises to prominence there. But you've got a villain, don't you? What's the name of the villain in Esther's story? Haman. Haman, of course. He's a power-hungry, ladder-climbing person in the Persian court, and he has a problem with the Jewish people. And where does that arise from? Yeah, Mordecai, Haman likes to parade around and have everybody bow down before him due to his position. And there was one Jew among the exiles says, no, none of that. Of course, that was Mordecai, and that just, as the old saying goes, that fried Mordecai's bacon, right? This one Jew dares not to show esteem for me, so he sets up a plot to exterminate the whole race, right? Kind of seems like a kind of an over what's the word I'm looking for? Reaction, there you go. Overreaction to a single problem, but sometimes that happens with power-hungry people like Haman. In chapter 4, Mordecai is given a vision, and of course this, again, even though God's name isn't used, God's at work here, and God's going to have a plan to rescue the Jewish people, and that rescue's road is going to travel through Esther. The last half of the book, chapters 5 through 10, we've got, instead of the grave danger of the Jews, we've got the great deliverance of the Jews. And again, God working behind the scenes through Esther thwarts Haman's plot. And we won't go into the story. You can read it. It's only 10 chapters. You can take some time this afternoon and read through it. It's a great story. You've got Esther's venture in rescuing her people. If you remember the story, she's a little reluctant to do it initially, right? This is a big task in a tough situation. Oh, okay. I thought you had your hand there, Peter. All right. And that Esther crosses paths with Haman. And of course, all he sees Esther as is, the queen. So he has to suck up to Esther. But little does he know that she's a Jew. And, by the time the dust all settles, and this is a quick overview, obviously, by the time the dust settles in the story, Haman has erected a hangman's noose, gallows. Yeah. Should have did my vocabulary work this morning. Gallows to hang Haman on for his insolence, and Haman ends up being hanged on his own instrument of death. What a story. Thoughts on that outline, or something jumps out at you? We've got some lessons to look at and a theme here, but pause for a moment if you want to add something. Okay. Yeah, I'm just amazed, and this is just what happens when people start to be hungry for power. I don't know if it's in Bible class last week. I mentioned Kendra and I are listening during meals to Everett Ferguson is reading through his books on church history. He's a great scholar in church history, but he's recounting from the birth of the church into the centuries that followed, and a lot of stories, but there was a lot of abuses as time went on, and that's, again, when you get humans involved in it, that's what happens. But just this week, what day it was, I mentioned to her, says it just would have been if Jesus would have just said something like, "Don't lord it over others," we wouldn't have the problem. Well, Jesus did say that, but it didn't make it any difference. So anyway, let's talk about the theme. And I hinted at this a little bit ago, but I've chosen providence as the theme for the book of Esther. And that's a word, and I meant to look up the exact definition of it. I forgot to do that. But providence is just the idea of God working behind the scenes, not in a direct way that we're kind of used to by reading in the New Testament. Sometimes God is right up front and right in the details. Here, again, no mention of God's name, but God is working providentially, the word we use, to bring these things about. And the Bible talks about a lot in other ways. The king is like water in the hand of God. The kings rise up and think they run the world, but God still has a say in all of that. God is providentially working out and protecting the Jewish people here in the story. Here's a theme verse that I've chosen out of the book, Esther chapter 4, verse 14. And this is probably a verse that usually comes up when you think about, a major verse in the story. Esther 4:14. Here is what Mordecai says to Esther when she's hesitant to step into this struggle. Esther says, boy, Mordecai says, you're the queen. You need to step up and rescue your people. And of course, that's a tough job for anyone. So she's hesitant, but Mordecai makes a statement to Esther rather. It says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. That's a powerful verse, isn't it? In a lot of ways. I love Mordecai's faith. He says a couple things here. First of all, he says, you know what, Esther? If you don't, take up the task here, God will handle it in another way. It may be after the Jews go through another persecution, but there's no doubt in Mordecai's mind that God's going to act on his time and his schedule. Go ahead.
Another thing, right from the start, Mordecai tells us before he even goes not to tell anybody who she is, that's God.
Okay? And that's the last part of this verse here. The other thing Mordecai talks about is here, he says, Esther, God may have providentially put you in this place, in this time, in this exact situation for just this need. And that's God's providence in a nutshell. It's hard to pick these things out sometimes, right? We're going through life and life goes by, and sometimes though, if you're paying attention, you run across those moments when he says, it just seemed like I was at the right place in the right time. I don't believe you ought to chalk all that up to coincidence. It might be sometimes. I'm not a determinist in the sense that I don't think God minutely arranges everything that's ever happened in history. But on the other hand, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say everything that happens is just a coincidence. No, I think God, again, we see that here. Much like the book of Ruth, the book of Esther is a testimonial to the providential care of God. But the time and the setting of the two books are very different. During the time of Ruth, the Israelites were living in their own land and in control of their own affairs. Now, part of Ruth's story happens in Moab. That's where she's from. But, Ruth and Naomi and her family have gone to Moab because of a famine. But by and large, you've still got the Jews living in their own land at that point. They were in control of their own affairs as much as they could be in times like that. But the book of Esther is different. Again, several hundred years later, they find themselves in a foreign land under a foreign ruler. And maybe the question that hangs in the air is, God still going to take care for his people in these kind of circumstances? And the answer is a resounding yes. Doesn't matter where they are, they serve a God who works through his providence. God, through his providence, puts Esther in a position of influence. Again, I would affirm it was not just a lucky break for Esther that she's chosen out of this large crowd of beautiful young women. I think, you probably can't point to a verse where it says God made the Persian king choose her, but I'll give him the credit for that. God, through his providence, influences the pagan king Ahasuerus to work in ways favorable to the Jews. You can track that through the story. And God, through his providence, rewards Mordecai for his persistent efforts. Don't forget about Mordecai. Esther is obviously the main story here, but God's working through Mordecai as well in challenging and through this. So, God's providential care. Go ahead, Jim.
A couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
God several times talks to the Jews about, I'm going to punish you, but sometimes I'll let up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little concerned about God endorsing Esther replacing wife. Our theology doesn't sign up for that. Now, I just think we need to be careful about that.
Sure.
Brother Brooks, look, I'm working married many years ago, and he used that as an example. That there are exceptions. There are things. And I just, during those times, God's doing a lot of things we can't hardly follow.
Sure.
He might not have any part of it.
Right.
That might be, Mordecai didn't say God said to him. Mordecai said,
Who knows?
to have it one way or another, and that could just be the Jewish mindset that we're going to come out on top.
Sure.
I'm not trying to be argumentative about it, but
Right.
it had to come to grips somehow with God endorsing, for lack of a better term, non-scriptural divorce.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother discussion here, but Jim's exactly right, and that's why I try to tread in these situations where we don't have a thus says the Lord, and this is why I'm doing it. Always tread carefully there. So keep in mind that God can providentially work through events that he didn't set in motion to do something good out of something that's not so good. God can do that. That's right.
Fixing
Right.
somehow. Wrong everything.
Romans 8:28, yeah. Uh-huh. Sure. Right. Yeah. Good point.
That will be right. Anything to follow. All that. Yeah, for one purpose. For one purpose, to bring the king to that.
All those threads start to come together.
Right.
Yeah, good point. All right, I've blathered on now. We've got just 5 minutes for several lessons. Let me go through them pretty quick. You can just think about them, or if you want to pause, we can talk about them a bit. But these things jump out at me from the book of Esther as things we could think about in our own life. Number one, as we've already emphasized, God often works behind the scenes in human events. Again, the extent of that is beyond our clear understanding sometimes, but the Bible affirms that he does. However, that's up to God. I'll obviously leave it in God's hands. The older I get, the more I'm inclined to not tell God what he can't do and can't do. Number two, there are times when we need to stand courageously in the face of fearful situations. That's Esther's story, isn't it? That probably wasn't her plan that day when she got up to rescue her nation. But she stepped up to the plate, and there's times in our lives when, it's time to stand up for what needs to be taken care of. Number three, God can position us for purposes beyond what we can see or understand. Who knows what God is doing, perhaps through you or me or someone else, in working ahead to bring events to what he's trying to accomplish. Again, I'll let God handle that. Number four, we are given a classic example in this story of the evils of pride. That's Haman, right? This is a classic story of when pride gets out of hand, and it's an ugly thing when it happens. That's Haman's story. But we also learn that evil plans can be thwarted and overcome. Never fall prey to the fact that, this world is so evil that nothing good can ever come out of it. God can take the most evil situation, and you might be surprised what he can do. God, if he doesn't thwart evil plans in the here and now, he'll take care of them ultimately. We can trust him for that. We can celebrate God's faithfulness. Yeah, Esther's a great hero, and we take nothing away from her and Mordecai, but never forget that God's the ultimate hero here, and God is faithful. We've talked a little bit about that this morning. As the Jews did with the Feast of Purim, and this is a place in the Bible where that feast is mentioned, Feast of Purim. It's built upon, among the Jews, Esther's story, and they did that as an annual feast to remember God's deliverance. And I would affirm that we probably need to have and find ways in our own life to remember and rejoice in God's deliverance. It doesn't have to be a feast day if we don't want it to be, but and there's a way in which we remember it every Sunday, but maybe there's something in your own life, something that you can set aside as just to think back and remember, a remembrance of what God has done for you and for me. And then finally, I guess that's the last one there. Thoughts on that? We are bumping up against it, but we got 3 or 4 minutes.
Thought on the before, in the Old Testament where it said, Nadab and Abihu, God, they offered strange fire or something, and then the fire came from the Lord and consumed them, and
fear fell on most.
Okay.
And I've often thought, man, it would be pretty devastating. That would be a real wake up
Okay.
to people.
Yeah.
That what God did back then, He's still God, He's still in charge, He still wants everybody to obey the gospel and be saved. Jesus is blessed and washed away their sins, but doesn't do exactly what He used to do back then, and it just seems like that would be a super wake up.
Yeah, well, we just need to, yeah, and we can probably be thankful that God doesn't deal with us in that way, because if He chose to always deal with it that way, we'd all be in, crispy critters. So, anything else? Let's see, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. I think I got the right next one. Job next week. We start to venture into the section of the Old Testament referred to as the wisdom literature. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those 5 books are part of a specific kind of Hebrew genre or type of writing referred to as wisdom literature. So we'll pick up with that story next week, a little bit bigger book, but some good lessons to learn there. Thanks for your comments and attention. Yep.